Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2 series, where today we'll be taking a look at the Telemetry HUD View, the various elements within it and how you can utilise those to work and refine tuning setups. Now what we've done so far is literally just load into a practice session in the BMW M6 GT3. We're at Monza in the night because night will allow us to see the Telemetry HUD View a little bit better. For the moment all I've done is just load up the default stable setup for the car, so not the baseline setup that we created last week, just the default stable setup that comes with the car. And then before we go out on track, if we just quickly go into the options under controls, edit assignments, game, you'll find this cycle HUD display option here, and having a button assigned to that will allow you to cycle through the various HUD views. Now going out onto the track, this is the default HUD view. It's been changed slightly for my own personal preferences as I've disabled a couple of HUD elements and rearranged the HUD layout a little bit, which is something that I'll cover in a future episode. But if I press that button that I have assigned to cycle the HUD views, I'll eventually come to this screen here, which is the Telemetry HUD View. Now we'll start off with the outer edges of the screen, as those are the more simple things to cover, and then we'll work our way inwards and explain those various elements there. Now starting up in the top left, we have our position, which is first of one because I'm the only car in the session. There's no other AI or human opponents, so just indicating that I'm first of one. Obviously it'll show you your actual race your position in your session, and then out of the total number of cars in your session. Below that is the total time that you have spent in your session, or the total time of the session, and then below that is your best lap that you have set in your session so far. Now, coming down into the bottom left, there's two little elements down here. We've got our actual steering inputs, and then to the right of that we have our force feedback information, which we covered in the force feedback episode, so I'm not going to touch base on that in this episode. Instead, if you want to learn how the force feedback graphs work, go back and watch the force feedback episode, as it's all explained in depth there. But going back just to the left of that, we actually have our steering input, which is indicated by the steering wheel. We then got two little white lines, which are the limits of our steering range. We've got the center of our steering range, i.e. Dead center straight wheel, which is indicated by the little downward arrowhead. And then as I turn the wheel left and right, you'll be able to see here that the bar is increasing and decreasing as I turn the wheel left and right, and that's also reflected obviously with the hand animations on the steering wheel inside the car as well. So it just shows your steering input. Now going over into the bottom right, we have our brake, our clutch, our throttle inputs. The brake is the red bar that you can see there. So the red bar, as I'm pressing up and down on the brake pedal, is increasing and decreasing. The grey bar on either side of the little element there that you can see increasing and decreasing is my clutch input, and then the green bar is my throttle input. Now inside of all that is our gears, so if I hold down the clutch and shift up and down through the gears, you can see that name number changing there. And then below that we've got our RPM. Just to the right of that we have our speed, which is in kilometers per hour, as I have it set to. It can also be set to miles per hour. And then to the right of that we actually have our power output and also our torque output from the engine. Now as you accelerate up through the power band, the power number and also the torque will obviously increase. It will get to peak torque and peak power at a certain point, and then it will drop back down and decrease again. Now to determine when the optimal shift point is for the car, you'll have to pay attention to the power output number. And generally you want to be shifting when the power output reaches its peak, which will then bring you up to peak torque when you make that shift up into the next gear, which will obviously then give you the best acceleration. So if I actually go ahead and actually drive out of the garage now, you can see as I'm accelerating out that we've got our horsepower is quite low at the moment, as we're currently sat on the pit speed limiter. But as I disengage the pit speed limiter and accelerate down the straight, you'll see the power output increase. It'll get to a certain number and then it'll decrease. And basically what I want to be doing is finding when the horsepower is at its peak and shifting at that time. So as we come out of the first 2 turns here and accelerate away, in the lower gears it'll be quite hard to determine as the number changes rather rapidly, but as we shift up through the gears, it starts to hang around peak power for a little bit longer. The numbers don't change as rapidly, and that will allow us to get a more refined pinpoint as to when the peak power actually is, and that will allow us to then determine when we want to be shifting gear. Now, looking at the numbers previously on the previous straight, it looked to be in and around about 515 to 520 horsepower. So if we pay attention now as we come out of this corner here and down the next lengthy straight, it goes up to about 517, 518, and then it drops back down. So I want to be shifting it in and around 517, 518, and with that be listening to the revs and also trying to figure out where in the actual rev range is that I want to be shifting. Now this is going to vary from car to car, from gear to gear, and also actually on the gear ratios themselves as well. But as I look at the number, it sounds like it's quite early in the rev range, so we'll pay attention to that on the next straight and see if we can shift at the optimal points. So shift now and shift now, which is pretty much when the blue lights come up on the dash of the car. So if I accelerate now, you'll get a set of green lights, set of blue, set of orange, and it's basically just as the blue lights come up is when I want to be shifting gear in the BMW M6 GT3, and I need to be braking here for turn 1. So that is how you go ahead and determine when is the optimal shift point for the car, and that will give you the best acceleration to reach your potential top speed even quicker. So pay attention to that number when you first jump in the car to figure out those optimal shift points. Now, going up into the top right hand side of the screen, if we go ahead and actually park up, we have our G meter. And this is represented by the various rings and also the blue dot, and as you can see, where we're stationary at the moment, that blue dot is dead center, meaning we are pulling 0G. And as we drive around the circuit, that blue dot will move around to represent the direction of G-force or the effect of G-force on the car. When we're accelerating, that blue dot will move down. When we're braking, it will move up. When we're turning right, it will move left, and when we're turning left, the G-forces will pull us to the right. Now there is a slight ghosting effect on this, and that acts as a histogram to allow you to be able to basically glance up at it when you're coming out of a corner and get an idea as to how many Gs you're pulling through that corner. Now each of the circles around that blue dot represents a G. So the first ring is 1G, the second ring outside of that is 2Gs, you then got 3Gs, and then the very outer thick ring is 4Gs. So as we accelerate here, you can see we're pulling roughly about 1G, and you can see that histogram moving around, but generally as we go through the corners you can see the G is pulling us or moving around left and right and acting upon the car. But generally the way you can use this is the more grip you have and the more grip that you're producing, the more Gs that you're going to pull. So use that to basically determine as to whether you've got the grip levels roughly right. The tyres will only be able to produce a certain amount of grip, so even though I'm braking here and turn into the corner, you can see they got to basically a peak amount of G, and then as the tyres lost traction and started to slip and started to scrub, the amount of G's actually decreased. So there you can figure out as to basically how much grip that a car is actually producing by the amount of G that it's producing. So there's the top and, shall I say, all the outer elements there, and let's move in towards the more central elements on the screen, where we can see the four corners of the car represented by the various icons that are there, and the center of the car is basically slap bang in the middle of the screen in the center of all those icons. So you can see the front left, the front right, the rear left, and also the rear right down there as well. Now with these, we got various bits of suspension information, we've got tyre information, and we've also got brake information. Now we'll start off with the tyres. First and foremost, the name of the tyres you can see is indicated there by the hard slick. That's because I'm on the hard slick tyres. If I was on wet tyres, it will indicate that I'm on wet. If we're driving with the Pirelli P0 Corsa tyres that are on a number of the road cars, it'll be indicated there with the name of the tyre that you're actually on. Above that is your tyre pressure, and as you can see, these are very, very slowly increasing at the moment. They started off at about 1.41 bar, which is the cold pressure that will set in the default stable setup. Obviously, if you change the tyre pressure values inside the setup, your starting pressures or the cold pressures will change. Now in practice and qualifying sessions, you don't have, or should I say in GT3, you don't have tyre warmers or tyre blankets, so your tyres are going to start off stone cold, which means that you'll start off with cold pressures, and as you drive around the circuit, the pressure will increase to eventually settle at what is known as a hot pressure, and this usually stabilizes in and around about 5 to 6 laps, maybe slightly more depending on the circuit. Now what you should be aiming for is a particular stable hot pressure depending on the car, the tyres, and the type of tyre that it's on. I'll link down in the description below to a post that Casey, our physics developer, posted on the official forums that gave the ideal optimal hot pressures for each of the different tyre types. So with the GT3 cars, you should be aiming for 1.8 bar, which is in and around, I think it's 23.6 psi. You could do a quick Google conversion on Google. You just type in 1.8 bar to psi, it'll give you how much psi 1.8 bar actually equals. But that is the hot pressure that you should be aiming for with the GT3 cars, and you should have 1.8 bar on every single corner of the car when it comes to 5-6 laps in. At the moment it's gone and increased above those because I was driving around a little bit, I generated a little bit of heat into the brakes where I've now become sat stationary. The heat is radiating off the brakes into the rims of the tyres, which is then heating up the core temperature of the tyres and also increasing the pressure from that. If I start driving again, you'll see that the tyre pressures will actually start to come back down, and these will basically fluctuate as various loads go through the tyres increase and decrease in temperature, and you'll see as you drive around that they'll fluctuate up and down depending on your actions. So at the moment, where there isn't really all that much temperature in the tyres, they're not really maintaining tyre pressure. But after 5-6 laps of driving, once tyres are up to stable temperatures, your pressures should stabilise, and that's when you should be aiming for that 1.8 bar optimal tyre pressure. When it comes to the actual race, generally your tyres will start off preheated, so your cold pressure will be a little bit different. I believe when it comes to the race with the GT3 cars, if you're using default tyre pressures, they start off at 1.7 bar, so they'll increase a little bit but not as much as they would when you're in a practice or a qualifying session where the tyres start off stone cold. Now, coming above the tyre pressures is the actual tyre icons, which show the temperature of the tyre and also how much tyre tread is actually left on the car. Now the amount of tyre tread is indicated by the amount of colour that is filling up those tyre bars. Now as I drive around and turn laps, this will obviously deplete as the tyre tread wears off, and once I have depleted all the tyre tread from the car, those colour icons will be completely empty. So if I was going to say, if I try and generate some heat into the tyres and try and wear some of the tyres down, you'll be able to see it depleting, but you can actually see it on the rear left tyre. You can see that some of the tyre tread has already started to deplete off the tyre as we've been driving, and that basically indicates the amount of tread that is left on the car. Once you've depleted all that tread, you'll be down to the carcass of the tyre, and once you get there, your lap times will be very heavily affected, as the car generally loses lap times, it loses grip as you wear through the tyres. So once you've basically killed off all the tread from the tyres, that is when you want to be pitting. Now, having just parked up, the actual tyre icons themselves, like I mentioned, also indicate temperature. Now when they're cold, they'll be indicated by blue, they'll go more green as they heat up, and then when you start getting to orange and red, that's when the tyres are actually overheating, and this will show the actual temperature of the tyres. And this is actually split into 3 vertical sections. So you've got the outer edges of the tyre are the set of left-hand numbers on the left-hand side of the car, and then on the right-hand side the outer temperatures are the right-hand numbers. The ones in the middle obviously represent the middle band, and then the ones closest to the center of the car represent the temperatures of the tyres on the inside band that is closest to the center of the car. Now you can use these to look at both tyre pressure, obviously your tyre temperatures, but then also use those to adjust cambers, and we'll talk quite heavily in depth with regards to camber when we actually get to the suspension episode later on in the series. But generally what you want is a decent spread in terms of temperature across the tyre. Generally what I tend to aim for is between 5 to 10 degrees centigrade across the width of the tyre. So on the front left, I'd like to have basically 5 to 10 degrees going from left to right. Generally the inside edges of the tyres, the ones that are closest to the centre of the car, will generally be hotter, because obviously as you have more camber, they're generally in contact with the track surface for a lot longer, therefore they're producing more friction, they're heating up for longer. But obviously as you go through the corners, you want to obviously optimize the camber to maximize the contact patch going through those corners, and that will heat up the central and outer parts of the tyre. Now when looking at the actual tyre pressures, what you want to be looking for is mainly that middle temperature of the 3. If that is above the either the outer edge or and also the inside edge of the tyre, that means that your tyre pressure is too high and you're ballooning the tyre, so it looks more like a motorbike tyre. And then if that is too low, i.e. the 2 outer temperatures are hotter than the inside temperature, then your tyre pressures are too low. Now if I go ahead and actually start driving around the track, you'll see that the tyre temperatures will increase. They've decreased quite significantly, because obviously I was sat stationary and therefore the tyres actually cooled down. But as we drive around the circuit and try and warm up the tyres, you can see that the inside edges of the tyres, the ones that are closest to the centre of the car, are generally are hotter than the centre and outer bands of the tyre. And like I said, you want that nice temperature spread across the width of the tyre, and you can use this to determine the camber settings that you want to be using, whether you want to be using a symmetrical setup or whether you want to be using a symmetrical setup in terms of camber. There are perks for using both, and we'll cover various neat little camber tricks when we get to that episode. But you can see there that the temperatures are starting to increase, and also we're taking off some of the tyre tread as we're driving around as well. So these icons give you a good indicator in terms of the tyre temperature and also whether you've got the right tyre pressures. I'm just going to slow down and clear that slowdown penalty. And we're now actually going to take a look at the brakes, which you can see are indicated there closest to the centre of the car for the 4 corners as well. Now these will show you the surface temperature of your brakes, and we have what is known as 2-layer brake heating in the game. So we have the surface temperature and also a core temperature as well. So as you can see, the brakes are getting about 200 degrees, decreasing below that. As you get hard on the brakes, they'll rapidly increase as we generate heat and slow the car down in the braking zones, and then they'll cool down as we accelerate and get up to speed. Now, the more open your brake ducts are, the quicker that the temperatures will cool, and obviously if you have them more closed, then they'll maintain a lot more of their temperature. But obviously if they're maintaining more of their temperature, when you do actually come into the heavy braking zones, they are more likely to heat. So you need to find that balance in terms of the how open you want your brake ducts to maintain control of your brake temperatures. Now, as I'm driving a GT3 car, we have steel brakes on the car. You've got some cars such as the Formula X and the Formula A and the LMP cars will have carbon ceramic brakes, and then road cars might have steel brakes or some lower performance brake materials as well. But the actual temperature ranges vary from the various different brake types. Now, with the steel brakes that we're on at the moment, we want to be aiming for stable pressures, or stable temperatures of 300 degrees going down the straights. But in the braking zones, we don't really want them to be peaking above 650 to 700 degrees. Within that range, that is basically where you'll find your optimal braking power. So when you're tuning your brake ducts, tune them so that when you've done a number of laps and you've built some core temperature into the brakes, which I'm still doing at the moment, it doesn't really go much below 300 degrees when going down the longest straight. But also likewise in the heaviest braking zone, you don't want them going above 650 to 700 degrees. So that's how you tune the brakes. Now, moving to the last part, which is the outer side of that, we actually have suspension information. You can see there we've got bump of 1.5 centimeters, which is the size of our bump stops, which are defaulted to 15 millimeters on the BMW M6 GT3. So that's represented there. Your travel actually indicates the amount of suspension travel that you have until you reach the bump stops. The height is then the actual height of the car from the ground. Now, if I come through these two Lesmos and then park up, you'll see that the height value will stabilize. So if I park up here, you can see there the height value is 6.4 centimeters on the front. Actually, if I release the brakes, there we go, is 6.1 centimeters on the front. That's the amount of height that I have from the road surface, and on the rear I've got 7.0 centimeters. Generally, the car has a little bit of rake set up, but this is obviously at a standstill where there's that tiny little bit of rake. As I'm driving along, the amount of downforce that goes over the cars will actually influence the ride height, and then obviously that will influence the car. So when it comes to tuning ride heights, you can look at these numbers, but the main ones that you want to be looking at are actually when you are driving along and you have airflow flowing over the car. So as you can see, generally the front is a little bit higher than the rear of the car. If I then go and brake, obviously the nose dips down and the rear end rises up to be higher. As I come through the corners, you can see the ride heights changing from left to right as we actually go through the turns as well. But if I go to the neutral throttle now, you can see that generally the car is pretty flat. It's relatively level. There's a little bit of difference in it, and obviously as we're going over surface bumps and things like that, the actual height and the travel is also changing as well. Now you can see that just as I went through that corner, you can see the suspension icon just to the right of those numbers is moving up and down, but it also flashed up red. Generally, when it flashes up red, this means that you are engaging the bump stops, or potentially getting to the limits of suspension movement on either end. I haven't quite 100% fully figured out what it actually is, as it seems to reflect bump stops when you've got bump stops in. But it does also work at both ends of the scale, where it comes to showing basically the limitations in terms of movement of suspension movement and travel. So if we come into this braking zone here, we've got two nice big orange sausage curbs. If we go and hit that, you saw there over on the right hand side, we went and hit the bump stop. Also there's a massive amount of suspension travel, as obviously the suspension and the wheels are fully extended, and obviously the ride height shot well up as well, as that side of the car got lifted away from the ground. So with these kind of numbers, what you can determine from this is basically the suspension stiffness, your ride height, and also whether you're engaging the bump stop or not as well. Generally, if you take away all the bump stop, you'll get more suspension travel. If you put more bump stop in, you'll have a lot less suspension travel. And then obviously the stiffness will affect how much the travel actually fluctuates, and then obviously the ride height that you set inside the car, and then also the actual downforce with the wing angles. Obviously the more wing angle that you have, the more downforce that you're going to produce. That will then obviously affect the ride heights as well. But when you are setting up the ride heights, you want to be aiming to set them up for when the car is in motion rather than when the car is at a standstill, because obviously that airflow will be pushing the car down in towards the surface of the track. And as you can see, the height of the rear is generally lower than the front. When I slam on the brakes, the nose dives down at the front and the ride height on the rear increases. So this is generally, this kind of information that you see here on the screen is how you can go about tuning and refining your car setup. Obviously I'll cover the various elements when it actually comes to those episodes, but this guide hopefully would have given you some insight as to what the screen is about, and help you also actually go ahead and start testing out various changes if you know what you're doing, and also what kind of things to actually look out for. So it's obviously it's a little bit of a preemptive episode where I'm placing this ahead, giving you this information now, so that when you do get to the episodes, when we actually go through the the tuning setup, you'll be able to take those changes and actually jump straight into the testing and the refining of those. So hopefully you guys found this episode rather useful and informative. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below, and I shall try and get back to you as soon as possible. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, guys. Hopefully I shall see you soon. Feel free to subscribe to the channel, like and share the video, and pass it on and share the knowledge. But other than that, hopefully I shall see you in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching. In the meantime, take care.